Okay, so I'm joined here today by Professor Katja Franko from the University of Oslo, who is going to talk to us a little bit about globalization. And Katja, as many of you will know, has written extensively about the effects of globalization for criminology, for how we study the kinds of topics that criminologists are interested in, and in particular, the impacts of globalization on mobility and the control of mobility. And today, I really was interested in talking to Katja about what she thinks might be changing, or perhaps not changing, under current conditions of the pandemic, when, of course, mobility is, for those of us who used to be free to move, is very constrained and is nonetheless happening for people who still need to move because of persecution and other problems. So it's a very big general question, Katja, but have you sort of started to revise any of your thoughts about globalization under the current conditions?
Thank you, Mary. It's a very good question. And first of all, thank you for inviting me. Actually, I've been debating with myself quite a lot about how to get my head around all of this. And because the situation is actually quite paradoxical. I think the pandemic, on the one hand, reveals actually the intensity and the extent of global interconnectedness, of which then is not only the interconnectedness in terms of security issues that I, for example, write in the book, but it's obviously also very intense interconnectedness in terms of health. And it has been sort of, in a way you could say, facilitated because of global travel, because of tourism, and so on. So in that way, you could say that it reveals the extent of how much we are all connected globally, and also how conscious we are then of the global situation. We are following events that are happening in other parts of the world, the vaccine project, and so on. However, on the other hand, you could say that with the pandemic, on some levels, localism has won. That very much probably through biopolitical necessity, but still the borders, both national and local, have really sort of fastened their grip on our existence, the grip that they used to have only for some or very large parts of the world population before, they are now having on our own existence of citizens in the global north or in the west. So in that way, you could say that this is a new development for us who enjoyed the privilege of unconstrained travel before. On the other hand, it's also a sort of a continuation of some of the trends that have been slowly taking place, or not so slowly also. The importance of the local, the importance of the national, most obviously with Brexit, with the election of Trump, Donald Trump as US president, and so on. So these are not that we are seeing that the national is sort of reinstating its importance. And I think a lot of border criminology scholarship has sort of pointing precisely to that. So in that way, I wouldn't say that we are seeing necessarily a reversal, but I think a re-articulation of this relationship between national, local, and global, that in some ways it is actually intensified. In some other ways, the local and national have sort of reinstated their importance as our main scales of existence, as you could say. So it's not a clear sort of situation, really, and in many ways, as I said, paradoxical.
And do you have any sense of, do you think these kinds of changes will stay with us, or do you have a sense of this as being just a temporary set of developments? Because I was actually thinking yesterday about the idea of the state of exception and emergency powers, and I was wondering what sorts of things people are writing about that body of literature, given that we are, is this a state of exception, or is this something which is here to stay, and does that change anything about the kinds of processes and developments that you were just discussing?
Oh, it's a very, very difficult question, because it is in a way trying to look into the future. But to me, it seems in a way that perhaps this kinds of situation force probably state agents or government agencies and to develop new approaches. And I was actually thinking about how to sort of explain this sort of cyclical fluctuations that we are seeing, that we, for example, we have been seeing in Norway when it comes to migration control, when suddenly Norway, which used to deport quite a lot of people, is not doing so many anymore because of the changed mobility situation. And I think my approach to that would be to look at the development of certain techniques of governance that developed in this intense migration crime control nexus that happened, for example, 10 years ago. And I think perhaps now what we are seeing is a certain development of techniques, approaches to governing social problems. Also when it comes to the pandemic, that then perhaps, even though the situation changes, might have continue to have an effect, even though not to the same level of intensity as they do now. And I think the sort of the centrality of the local and the national perhaps is sort of reconfigured through the situation that we are living in now.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. I mean, maybe I'm straying off topic a little bit, but I've been reflecting here in the United Kingdom, where before the pandemic, I mean, I suppose before the pandemic, there was already a shift. There was already being a decline in the use of detention, and also a decline in the ability to deport. And then during lockdown, they released almost everybody, and they were unable to do any deportations. And now they're restarting. But so they're restarting deportations. The numbers are still quite low, but there's still a kind of desire for that. So there's still a desire for the national and for the sort of boundary there. But what they don't seem to be so interested in is building back the detained population. And that's partly a public health issue. So it's partly about, if you put lots of people together in a custodial institution, you have to manage their health. And so you have to quarantine and what have you. But it's partly because I think they've figured out that there are actually other ways of doing it. And you can do it, you can be a bit quicker probably. And so then that raises other questions, is that a better system, on what measure, But I wonder a little bit whether what we'll find is that there will be certain practices that kind of stay, and then other ones which will have changed through innovations caused by the health crisis, but which actually leave in place some of the fundamental structures of coercion and differentiation.
Yeah, I think that is actually a very good and interesting point. What I've sort of also been interested in is, in a sense, techniques of how we as citizens are connected to our own, you could say, the category of national belonging, and then how risk attributes are connected to these categories. That in a way, what health authorities in most countries, at least Western countries, are doing is sort of dividing other countries into risks and painting them different colors depending on where it's risky to travel and so on. And so for example, Norway, Sweden suddenly became a country which was a risky one, and the citizens of that country became risky. And this kind of sort of risk thinking connected to nationality is not something new. It is just that it was much more extensively used before for citizens from the global south. But the EU would have all these different categories of travelers and blacklisted countries. They wouldn't be red, but they would be black, and so on. So that in a way is a technique that is suddenly changed the subject, but the way of thinking is actually quite similar. And this is what I mean in terms of that what we know is not, I mean, the world is different, but some of the ways of thinking and connection of the body, the citizen, and the category of risk, nationality, all this is actually quite similar, and it has been developed through various through a longer period of time then.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think because we're trying to make short videos that can be helpful for teaching and for learning, so I think we'll stop there. There's all sorts of fascinating ideas, and obviously, you know, we can't predict what's going to happen in the future, but I think reflecting on the impact of the current moment on some of the practices that we're quite familiar with now is actually very helpful for honing our own categories of analytical analysis. So thank you very much, Katja.
Thank you, Mary.
I'll now pause the recording.